My name's Alan Weil. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Health Affairs. We're very pleased to be a partner in this event. I want to add my thanks to you all for being here, and particularly my appreciation to Ashish and John for the collegial way we've put this together. We each bring great strengths to this topic, and I think together we do something none of us could do individually, and I want to echo Ashish's comment at the beginning that we hope this is the beginning of more, even if we have to leave the rarefied air of Washington, D.C. and Cambridge, Massachusetts to do so. It is truly my honor to be able to introduce our keynote speaker today. It is often said, just look at the bio. There's so much there, and indeed there is, but I think it's important that you understand, if you don't already, the great credibility and accomplishments of our speaker today, Tony Fauci, who's director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. As you'll hear in his remarks, he served under 5 presidents, which I think is quite relevant to the conversation we've been having already this morning. He was one of the principal architects of the creation of PEPFAR. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, many awards, including the National Medal of Science and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Dr. Fauci has 43 honorary doctoral degrees, author, co-editor, editor of more than 1,290 scientific publications. He brings experience and credibility and perspective. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fauci.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I've spoken at after-dinner speeches and intra-dinner speeches, but I've never spoken to a line of people waiting to get their food. So it's nice to have you. Anyway, it's the idea that we are now a few days away from a new administration obviously prompted the really extraordinarily, very enjoyable, and I'm really pleased I had the opportunity to listen to the panel, both of Amy and Ron, and as well as Bill and Dr. Jafari, which really, I think, set the stage for so many of the things that we are going to be dealing with over the coming years. Given, as you heard from the introduction, that I have been around for a while and have had the opportunity and the privilege and the pleasure of serving in 5 administrations, I thought I would bring that perspective to the topic today, is the issue of pandemic preparedness. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak. And I hope by the end of my relatively short presentation, you will understand why history, the history of the last 32 years that I've been the director of NIAID, will tell the next administration that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with. So for those who think that infectious diseases is gone, there's so many people who've made foolhardy statements not knowing at the time that they made them. I usually show a quote from an old surgeon general or an old pundit in infectious disease. So I thought I'd pull this one out from Sir Macfarlane Burnet, who was actually a Nobel Prize-winning immunologist, who made the statement, as many did, to write about infectious diseases is almost to write of something that has passed into history. The most likely forecast about the future of infectious diseases is that it will be very dull, which is really kind of interesting coming from a semi-genius like Macfarlane Burnet. And I think what he did, and the mistake that so many people have made, is something that several of our panelists have already referred to. And that is a failure to look beyond our own borders in the issue of the globality of health issues, not only things that are there that will come here, but surprises that we have. So when I think about infectious diseases, I break it down into a few buckets. the established infectious diseases that we know, and when I say I know, we mean that you could reasonably predict today what the disease burden of morbidity and mortality is going to be next year. In my mind, that's the Tony definition of an established infectious disease. But there are also other issues that we're talking about now, are diseases that are brand new, that we've never seen them before, or much more common, diseases that reemerge. So let's take a very quick look at established infectious disease and show you what I mean. So there are diseases and disease burden, and these are projected every year, and they're almost always right. For example, lower respiratory infections, and these are deaths. There's going to be over 2.5 million deaths. There are about 1.6 to 1.8 million deaths of tuberculosis, hepatitis B and hepatitis C, diarrheal diseases. It is of note that I have HIV/AIDS here on an established infectious disease. When I was giving this lecture, and I'm going to get to it in a moment, it was an emerging infectious disease. And now, after 35 years and 6 months, it is an established infectious disease. So let's take a look at the burden, and then we'll quickly go on to the emerging. So by the last count of that article that came out in Lancet just this past year, if you look at the total of 56 million deaths worldwide each year, about 15% of them are infectious diseases. That used to be 27% when I first started giving this lecture. And what that tells us is some of the advances we've made in vaccinations and antibiotics and what have you. But if you look regionally, it is still the #1 cause of DALYs, which is disability-adjusted life years, which is death plus disability in the developing world in individuals from birth to 49 years old. So it still is a major problem. So that's established infectious diseases. But now we're talking about what an administration might face in regard to emerging diseases. And I'm going to just put them together into newly and re-emerging diseases, and I'll get in a second to what I mean. So from my own personal experiences, why I can say with some confidence that history tells us that we will definitely get surprised in the next few years. So it all started for me when I became director of NIAID, and that was in 1984. And this is the NIH record showing this young immunologist who just took over as the director of NIAID. And over the years from then, as you've heard in the introduction, I've had the opportunity to serve 5 and advise 5 presidents. And these are the 5 presidents, and I'm going to go into the things that I had to advise them about. But before I do that, just to show you the importance of these diseases, this is a picture of me in the very early 80s, one of my first testimonies before a congressional committee. Now, there are 2 aspects about the number I'm going to tell you, and that is that we went back with my ledge office at the NIH, and I've testified, and this is not briefings, these are official testifying before the Congress, either the Senate or the House, since I became director, approximately 250 times. And every single one of those was related one way or another to an emerging infectious disease. It started off with HIV, and then it went up to the last few that we did, that I had the opportunity to do with Tom Frieden and with Sylvia Burwell and others with Zika. And we did about 10 or 12 of those with that. So when I first started and I began to testify, it was right in, because I became director in 1984, and HIV, we first found about it in 1981. So I wanted to testify before the Congress and make the point, this is 32 years ago, that there are emerging infectious diseases. So I drew a map, I sketched it, I'm not that good an artist, and I had my graphics people do it, a sort of a map of the United States of America. And I put on the map this new emerging infectious disease, which is HIV/AIDS. And I take that map, and one way or another, every single time I testify before the Congress, particularly for my budget, almost always for my budget, and I talk about global health and emerging infectious diseases, I add one, sometimes two, sometimes three, either new diseases or re-emerging diseases. And the last time I did that was this past spring. And this is what the map looked like. This is the accumulation of things that have emerged. Sometimes they're blips on the radar screen, and sometimes they're profound. So for me, it started off with Ronald Reagan. And the two that he had is one that was under the radar screen and only years later became, but one that we should have paid more attention to at the time. And I show you this because there's outbreaks that are very profound, acute, and dramatic, like Ebola, like what we've seen with Zika. And then there are outbreaks that may be really subtle. They're happening, and you're not necessarily noticing them. And that's exactly what happened with the first outbreak that I had to deal with. And that was the outbreak of HIV/AIDS, which we first became aware of in 1981 with the now very famous two MMWRs, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Reports from the CDC, first of 5 gay men, and then a month later of 26 gay men, first in LA, and then in LA, New York, and San Francisco. At the time, we thought this was an American gay disease. We did not know that as we were talking about these two MMWRs, there were likely hundreds of thousands of people in sub-Saharan Africa who were already infected, but nobody noticed it. This was something that actually changed my career, and I talk about it often because as an infectious disease immunologist at the time, I said to myself, this is going to be really, really bad. And I try to get people interested in it, and very few people did, with some exceptions. The CDC certainly was. We were up here. So what I did is I tried to give, I refer to it as my apologia pro vita sua. I could say that in Georgetown because you all take Latin, right? Okay. Which is really an explanation for what you're doing with your life. So I wrote an article and sent it into the New England Journal of Medicine. They rejected it because they said it was too alarmist. So then I sent it to the Annals of Internal Medicine. I wrote it in 1981 in December, and it got published in June of 1982. And I said, because we don't know the cause of this syndrome, any assumption that it's going to remain restricted to a particular segment of our society is an assumption that is truly without scientific basis. And unfortunately, that was one of the more prophetic things that I have said, because if you fast forward now 35 years, when I said this, there were about 125 reported cases of HIV to the CDC. And we didn't even know it was HIV then. We were calling it GRID. Fast forward, and now we have about 80 million cases, about 35 to 40 million deaths, 36 million people living with HIV, 1.1 million deaths a year, 2.1 million new infections. During the first administration that I dealt with, there was not the proper attention that was paid to it because of a number of reasons, one of which nobody perceived that it was going to be particularly important. But it was when George H.W. Bush was vice president running for president, he came to the NIH and had the opportunity to show him around and really brief him very, very intensively about this new emerging outbreak that people were now starting to pay attention to. So George H.W. Bush really took on HIV/AIDS, and the budget of the NIH went very, very, very high. And here's a picture of George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush in the solarium, and those people who are dressed around him are my patients who got all dressed up to talk to the President of the United States and his wife, Barbara Bush. And here he is listening very attentively, and I'm sitting right next to him, and one of my prized patients is between him and Barbara Bush, and he really did get it. But he got it at a time when, remember, we missed several years before of realizing how extraordinary this outbreak was going to be. And the budget for the NIH comparably went up. If you look at the time that George H.W. Bush became president and the time that he left the presidency, we had a dramatic increase in the HIV/AIDS budget, which led to extraordinary advances in every one of the areas on these yellow boxes. I could spend the entire 25 minutes, half hour, talking about each and every one of these individually, but the one that was the most important, and it gets to one of the things that was said during the panel with Ron and with Amy about the scientific aspects of the investments in science, because it was the investment in science that led to treatments which completely turned around what was one of the most depressing things that we possibly could have faced, a disease that was essentially 100% fatal. So here again is a picture of me making rounds on our ward in the early 80s, and the reason I show it is because at that time we had no therapy. This was 1982-83. And the only thing we were doing was putting Band-Aids on hemorrhages, and people were dying. But it was the scientific endeavor, the investment, ultimately in billions of dollars, that led to the drugs that we have now that have completely turned around the course of an HIV-infected individual, such that the median survival in this picture was about a year to 15 months. Today, in the same room that I see patients, the median survival now is an additional 50+ years, which is one of the most extraordinary scientific advances that has been made in response to a new outbreak. So one of the things we did back then, and I did this with my colleague Greg Folkers in my office, we put together a commentary in JAMA saying, you know, we've been quite successful with HIV/AIDS. Perhaps there are implications for other infectious diseases of global health importance. And what are the lessons that we learned from HIV? One, you have to commit substantial financial and human resources. These things don't get addressed spontaneously by themselves. You have to enlist the best and the brightest investigators in both basic and clinical research. You have to involve the community, be it the gay community in the United States or the community in Africa and West Africa when we dealt with Ebola, or the people in South America when we're dealing with Zika. You have to have cross-sector collaboration. You can't do it alone. The CDC can't do it alone. The NIH can't do it alone. You do it with all of us, with industry, with global organizations, with philanthropy and NGOs, and you got to get the leaders and the policymakers involved. Those are the principles we learned, and we applied them. So from an NIH perspective, and I have to take that because that's where I'm coming from, these are the things that we get involved with: basic and clinical research, genomics, expansion of research capacity, like we did in West Africa and Liberia, the way the CDC did in Sierra Leone, the way INSERM did in Guinea, ultimately to develop countermeasures. So let's get back to my map now and take a look at it. I mentioned that there was also the trickling of dengue in the Americas, because remember, dengue is an Asian African disease, and it came in under the radar screen, but now we're really addressing it. And so when you look at dengue, right now we have our sights on dengue. They're very much the same way as we're doing with Zika. And actually, this is a release from just this spring in which we now have an experimental stage, a phase 3 clinical trial. We have an approved dengue vaccine that we need to do better on because it's only about 60-some-odd% effective. So we really want to get one that's up in the 85 and 90%. So that was George H.W. Bush. Then things started to heat up a bit when we got to President Clinton, because he had to deal with HIV. It wasn't going away. But now we had some other things: West Nile, H5N1, antibiotic resistance. We go back to the same paradigm of the things you need to do. You need to do basic research. The CDC does public health. The WHO does what they do. And you wind up with countermeasures. And let me take a look with you at some of the things we had to deal with and some of the briefings of those 200-plus briefings that we had to do. One was West Nile. West Nile is re-emerging. It isn't new. It was in Africa and the Middle East likely for hundreds of years. Then either a mosquito, a bird, or a person got on a plane in Israel and landed at Kennedy Airport, and then, boom, we now have West Nile, which is endemic in the United States. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to develop countermeasures, such as vaccines. Now, it's very interesting. When we first started to develop a West Nile vaccine, we had a successful vaccine. It was safe. It induced a good immune response. We couldn't find a company to partner with us to develop it in an advanced way. That is not the case now with Zika, since there are a number of companies that are very interested in that. Then there's the issue of antimicrobial resistance, which we have gotten very deeply involved with, up to and including the current president who gave an executive order. So I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but these are not things that just stay with one administration. They spill over into the other. So we first in earnest started to see it back then, so we really addressed it, as we've done in so many other things. Then came George W. Bush. Again, HIV/AIDS was still prominent, but he had to deal with something that was really brand new here: anthrax, the beginning of H5N1, and SARS. Now, when you talk about presidents worrying that when they get into office, there's going to be something they have to deal with, some health issue that's going to be very disconcerting, well, it was a double whammy for George W. Bush, because not only did we have the terrible events of 9/11, but juxtaposed in the fall, in October, right after the 9/11 issues, we had the anthrax attacks. And then all of a sudden, a new outbreak that a president and the departments had to deal with was bioterrorism. And in fact, this is one of the articles that we wrote back then 15 years ago, Cliff Lane and John LaMontagne and I, in Nature Medicine, about bioterrorism and the kinds of things we need to do to prepare for bioterrorism. The country took this very seriously. There were strategic plans for the Category A agents, namely agents that we knew had been stockpiled by the Soviet Union before the fall of the Iron Curtain. Those were smallpox, anthrax, botulism. So I had the opportunity of dealing very closely with President George W. Bush and his staff in dealing with how we're going to address bioterrorism. And I had a very interesting experience, which I'll always treasure. We were going up to Pittsburgh together with the president, with D.A. Henderson, with Secretary Thompson and others, to look at a new facility for modeling the possibility of a bioterror attack. So I had the privilege of being on Air Force One, and the president called me up to his compartment and said, "Tony, what scares you most about potential microbial attacks?" And he was talking about a terrorist. And I told him, I said, "Mr. President, I worry more about the natural occurrence of an influenza pandemic and the ongoing plague of HIV than I do about a bioterror attack." That doesn't mean you want to diminish a bioterror attack, but it does mean that you have to pay attention to the natural causes. And with regard to HIV, in his presidency, as we all know, the president did something that is historic. He established PEPFAR in his State of the Union address in January of 2003, and announced a program which initially was $15 billion to prevent 7 million HIV infections, treat 2 million HIV-infected individuals, and care for 10 million, which turns out now unequivocally to be the most important global health endeavor that has ever been established in history with regard to any single disease. Now, getting back to nature being a bioterrorist, all of a sudden, everybody started to notice that, and the first hint we got about that, and this was still during the George W. Bush administration, was bird flu, H5N1. It emerged in 4 Asian countries. It then jumped into humans in a very ineffective way. Bill Steiger's up there. He and I took a trip to Southeast Asia with Secretary Leavitt to take a look at what was going on there. And the administration took this very seriously. They invested over $7 billion to prepare us for bird flu. So just the way you had the bioterror strategic plan, all of a sudden, we had a pandemic influenza strategic plan, which is actually in effect right now. We still work through that plan. The CDC, the FDA, the NIH, we all use that plan. And again, getting back to the things that we did with the diagnostics, the therapeutics, we started to develop a vaccine. And we preemptively made a vaccine for H5N1, and we put it in the strategic national stockpile, the same way as we have one for H7N9. We haven't had to use it yet, but the idea of having something ready to go originated way back during the H5N1 days, but we really decided we needed to do better with our technology. So we advanced from egg-based to cell-based to finally recombinant DNA technologies, and we're continuing to develop better vaccine platforms. So if that wasn't enough, then SARS came along. Now the thing about SARS really scared us because it came on and it came on very fulminantly. It started off in China, went to Hong Kong. You all know the story. It's an epidemiologist's delight. I mean, if you want to specialize in epidemiology, you just got to read this, and if you have any children you want them to go into epidemiology, tell them the SARS story. They'll all go into epidemiology. And it was someone who went to a hotel in Hong Kong. 19 people in that hotel got on planes and went to different parts of the world. And then we had the SARS outbreak, 8,000 cases, almost 800 deaths. Not only was it a public health issue, it was an economic issue. This is a picture of a near-empty flight from Hong Kong to Beijing in May 2003. It really put everything to a halt economically, including in Canada, because Canada had a big problem. So what did we do? Right then again, we jumped on with new technologies, because now we have rapid sequencing. You don't have to grow the virus. You can rapidly sequence it. And we wound up developing a SARS vaccine that we, again, never had to use. And the reason we didn't have to use it, because the public health measures completely put the lid on it. So here's an example of public health measures that are antiquated, if you want to call it that, working perfectly in stopping an outbreak. So then we get to the present time. A lot of headaches for this administration with regard to outbreaks. I mean, they had more than their share. There was the H1N1 pandemic right soon after the president came in. Now, remember, I know everybody in this audience is sophisticated about that. You see his presidency, 2009 to 2017. What happened in 2009 as soon as he walked in the office? The H1N1 2009 pandemic flu. That's the kind of thing that is very intimidating as well as disruptive to an administration. And then we had the other things which we'll get to: MERS, chikungunya, Ebola, Zika, AMR. Back again to this. So right now, the threat of bird flu isn't just H5N1, H7N9. Even today, we're starting to see things like H5N8. So it's all over the place. So what's the answer to that? What's the best way to address that? I think most of you know what I'm going to say in the next slide, is something that we really have to get successful, and that is the development of a universal influenza vaccine, namely a vaccine that is not only effective against seasonal flu changes, but also pandemics, so that you do not have any distinguishing features between how you prepare for one or the other. And this is something that Gary Nabel and I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago when we were talking about the work that we started, and it's coming along pretty well. We don't have it yet. We're probably not going to have it for a few years, but we're getting closer and closer to a universal flu vaccine. So just as soon as we thought we got that under control, then in 2013 came chikungunya. The reason it's important, it came to the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, which was our territories. It had never been in the Western Hemisphere before. And then all of a sudden, this is what it looked like after a while. Again, together with the CDC and the FDA, we wound up developing a chikungunya phase 2 trial vaccine, which we're doing now. So by that time, you would think that all of us involved, with the CDC and the FDA and the secretaries, were really kind of getting exhausted. But it gets worse, because then we wind up getting Ebola, as we all know. Ebola, which had 24 outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa, anywhere from 2 people to 200 people, then came away in a new circumstance, which I referred to as the perfect storm. 3 countries geographically overlapping each other, very poor, disorganized, no healthcare system, crowded, and being very, very skeptical of authority. Made it extremely difficult. But after 28,000 cases and 11,000 deaths, we finally got our arms around the good public health measures as well as the research, again, that we mentioned, that Ron and Amy and others mentioned. We did a program in Liberia. The CDC did a program in Sierra Leone. The WHO did one in Guinea, and we wound up, after all was said and done, with having a vaccine, having a drug that looks promising. We haven't nailed it down yet, but also understanding a lot about the disease. Now, the only thing that put a little bit of a monkey wrench into things was one of the things that Ron and Amy had mentioned, and that is the fear associated with what happens when what's over there can come here. The fear was totally inordinate about what the reality was. Namely, when one person came, landed in Dallas, 2 nurses got infected. But what we did is that we started then something that we had been working on for years, just in case there would have been an accident where we would have to take care of somebody. So what happened is that there were special Ebola units, and the NIH was one of them. The one was in Nebraska, one was in Emory, and we trained considerably for that. And we had the opportunity right here to show that in the developed world, when you have the capabilities of taking care of people the way we did, the way they took care of some of the people in Nebraska and in Emory, we at NIH had the opportunity to take care of Nina Pham. And here's one example of me discharging her publicly in front of the NIH when she was shipped to us right after she got infected in Dallas. But even more importantly, when we had the opportunity to really get involved in the care of a desperately ill patient, and I can't tell you who this person is because he does not want to be identified, but this is my team waiting for him outside of the NIH back entrance. Here we are getting ready to go on the elevator. And the way we did it, the training we have, and I'm telling you this because it contrasts in a way to show what the people that, like Dan Lucy and others who went to West Africa and really got their boots on the ground and did it under very difficult circumstances. We had 2 teams. One was an infectious disease, and one is a critical care unit. And we rotated every 2 hours with the 2 people always in the room with multiple nurses and others. And here's an example of me and a guy named Dan Chertow. Dan is the ICU guy. I'm the infectious disease guy. Here we are getting suited up, ready to go. And this patient was one of the sickest patients I've ever seen. And I've taken care of thousands of very sick patients. So the reason I show you this is that I'm on the left and Dan is on the right, tending to this young man who no doubt would have died if he were out in the field in West Africa. But importantly, taking care of somebody under those circumstances in intensive care, even with an air-conditioned room, it gets very, very uncomfortable after about an hour in there. So I made a rule, nobody stays in more than 2 hours. So you could imagine what the people who were in West Africa went through when they were in 105, 110-degree heat. The good news about the story, he left the NIH really well. He walked out of the hospital. I walked him over to the car where his mother and father were waiting for him, and I gave him a brand new red NIH T-shirt. Finally, Zika. We all know about Zika. Zika in the Americas, I wrote an article for the New England Journal in January of 2016, 1 year ago, almost to the day, talking about the fact that this is not new. This is yet again another arbovirus. But again, for epidemiology, should we have seen it coming? We know it was discovered in 47, first cases in 52, and it worked its way across the Pacific. So when it got to Yap Island with an outbreak, the outbreak essentially attenuated itself. In 2013, an outbreak in French Polynesia, and then it got to, just like with Ebola in West Africa, what I call the perfect storm. A completely immunologically naive country, Brazil, a very, very populous country, a country with an awful lot of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, and then you had what we saw was an outbreak, which would have been inconsequential given the fact that, relatively speaking, in the big picture of diseases, Zika is not a big deal, except thanks to the good observation of the Brazilian public health officials. What they did notice was the great catastrophe of Zika, namely the extraordinary spike in microcephalic cases where kids born with microcephaly, which is just the tip of the iceberg, because we're now starting to see that the congenital Zika syndrome goes well beyond microcephaly. Again, we put into full-blown the same pattern, the basic clinical research, developing countermeasures, and now we have a situation where we have a series of vaccines, and this is a complicated slide just to tell you that 2 of them are already in phase 1 trial, the first one getting ready to go into phase 2 trial in February of this year. The first one is a DNA, the second is a Zika particle inactivated, and a company that BARDA is collaborating with, Moderna, just started their phase 1 literally yesterday or the day before. So what are the 2 approaches to end up this discussion? There are 2 approaches you do when you come to a situation with regard to vaccines and diagnostics. You preemptively develop pathogen-specific countermeasures. There is some merit, and I put in parenthesis, some. But that's a dangerous thing if that's all you do, because as Ron said, and as Amy said, and as others have said, if we made a list, Ebola wouldn't have been on our list, and Zika wouldn't have been on our list. So a pre-developed list has a place, but it's not the total answer. One of the things you do need to do is develop universal platforms, the way we are with vaccines, the way we're doing with diagnostics. So when you get a new microbe, you get the sequence, you insert the gene into whatever the platform is, VSV, DNA, mRNA, whatever it is much, much quicker than having to worry about going from scratch in trying to grow a microbe. What about the lessons learned? I've already said it about HIV. They're about the same. Global surveillance. These are all things that Ron and Amy and others mentioned to you during the panel. Transparency and communication, infrastructure, capacity building, coordination and collaboration, the platform technology that I mentioned, and I am very much in favor of what everyone has said here today, namely we do need a public health emergency fund. It's tough to get it for the reasons that Ron mentioned, but we need it, because what we had to go through for Zika, I mean, it was very, very painful when the president asked for the $1.9 billion in February and we didn't get it until September. That was a very painful process. Examples to develop flexible vaccine capacity. There are a lot of things going on out there. The Global Fund for Vaccine Development, the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, that you may have heard of. GSK has built a facility to be able to hit the ground running, and then we have BARDA. So I'm going to end with the last slide, and that is the administration, next to last slide, the administration that is going to come in the next few days. Will there be a resurgence of Zika? We're getting into the summer of the South America. Are we going to see a resurgence or not? What about influenza? Are we going to get a new pandemic? And the third bullet is probably the most important. What about things that we're not even thinking about? But what is for sure that no matter what, history has told us definitively that it will happen, because infectious diseases, as I said 8 years ago in this article with David Morans and Greg Folkers, that it is a perpetual challenge. It is not going to go away. So the thing we're extraordinarily confident about is that we are going to see this in the next few years. Thank you.
So I know Dr. Fauci only has a few minutes. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then depending on how willing you are to cut it close, we'll keep going. But you mentioned the importance of not going it alone. Bill Steiger earlier talked about hostility sometimes with the private sector. We're looking at a new administration. You've been through administrations of both parties. It seems like an opportunity here. A positive opportunity is a new leader who maybe has a more positive association with private sector initiatives. If you were to set a course for opportunities in that context. What would you advise the new president to do in terms of partnerships with sectors outside of government?
Well, I mean, I would say this to an incoming administration, but I would also say it even if we were in the middle of an administration, that when you're dealing with the need to develop countermeasures, partnering with the private sector is absolutely essential. I mean, we do an awful lot in the fundamental basic research and the early type of development, but if you want a product that's going to be widely used, you have to partner with and embrace the private sector. There's no doubt about that. That's a sine qua non of what we do.
And are there concrete steps you would recommend to make that?
To be honest with you, we're already doing a lot of it now, so it becomes very clear that we are very industry friendly when you talk about getting a pharmaceutical partner. We try to get it from the very beginning. We do something that I've referred to as de-risking, namely pharmaceutical companies that have a reluctance to jump right in the development because they're not sure whether this is going to be a economically viable product. They tend to hold back. But if you do the basic research, the early clinical studies, and bring up the process closer and closer to the end game, they are much more enthusiastic about coming in. And we do a lot of that. In fact, we've done it right now. We're doing it with DNA. We have a DNA product. We don't yet nail down a final pharmaceutical partner, but we're getting a lot of nibbles now because we're well into the phase 1 going into the phase 2. And that takes away a lot of the risk of the company.
Others have referenced the importance of agility. You mentioned it as well. In addition to a fund which provides resources that can be used flexibly, what other aspects of either what we've done or what we need to do would provide us with the kind of agility that we need to respond to threats that are at this point unknown?
Okay, well, those are good questions. One of them is to regulatory flexibility. And I have to say, I really want to tip my hat to the FDA because over the last several years, without cutting any corners, they have worked with us right from the very beginning in the sense of usually you start on a project, you go towards a product early, then you get a product, you need to bring the FDA in for a final approval. Right now, whenever we do anything, we get them involved right from the very beginning to make sure we're right on the right track. They don't design the pathway for us because they can't do that, but we always go with them very, very early on. I think that's one of the things we need to do.
Great. We learned a lot of lessons from HIV and AIDS. We also made a lot of investments in infrastructure that are still there. You mentioned the persistent burden of infectious disease, but the majority of deaths globally from non-communicable diseases. In a resource-constrained environment, how do we look at the infrastructure we've built, the infrastructure we're building around other diseases to leverage that to expedite our response to emerging infectious diseases?
Okay, I think the classic example among a few that really is a success story is PEPFAR. So, for example, the countries that have benefited and the organizations that have benefited globally from PEPFAR, when other challenges came along, the PEPFAR countries inevitably did better than the non-PEPFAR countries because they already had that infrastructure in place. So PEPFAR is a good example. Then there are individual capacity building events that have occurred. So when we went into West Africa, we concentrated on Liberia because of the traditional USA involvement in Liberia. And we made it a point that when we started the vaccine and the treatment and the survivor trials, that we said we would do that in the context of building a sustainable infrastructure. So we have rules now that we don't go into a country unless we're going to leave something there that they could continue. It isn't in and out. That was not the mindset years ago.
So I know you're on the infectious disease side, but are there lessons we can learn from investments around non-communicable diseases?
Oh,
as
yeah.
well?
I mean, obviously, when you look at some of the clinics that got set up with PEPFAR, maternal child health is benefiting greatly from that. Cancer screening with HPV and others is benefiting greatly by that. And that all is emanating from PEPFAR.
I know you have limited time. I don't know if we can convince you to take a couple of questions.
I'll
but
be happy to.
We'll follow the same rules as earlier, a quick introduction and a quick question, and we have time for a few more before our closing. But I see a hand right here.
Hi, I'm Kavita Berger from Griffin Scientific. I have a question that you refer to very nicely in your presentation, and also Ron Klain had referred to in his presentation, which is really leveraging the scientific information to be able to understand what's going on and then respond in an appropriate way. And as you obviously know, yesterday the federal guidance came out on how agencies and departments should implement dual-use research of concern with pandemic potential. This is an ongoing thing for 5 years or more. How do you balance those types of policy and regulatory sort of issues with wanting to have and build a robust scientific capability to address some of these real problems?
Well, I mean, obviously, and the answer is going to sound somewhat simplistic, but it is that you always guide by the science as long as you stay within the general rules and regulations that are made by society. I don't see the P3CO is what they're calling it, right? Pandemic potential pathogens of something concern and oversight and something or other. We've been dealing, as you know, we've been dealing with that for years. It has not interfered with our ability to do the kinds of research that we want to do on pathogens of concern. It just hasn't. And if you look at the big picture of what's been done, the good news about that is that it sets up now a evidence-based scientific system to evaluate experiments as you're thinking of planning them. So rather than saying, do it and then see if it worked out or not, it says, this is what you want to do. These are the guidelines. If you go by the guidelines, then we know what you're doing. I haven't seen this interfere in any way with anything that I think is scientifically important.
Looking out. Okay, then I'm going to ask one last question. Yeah, unless I'm just blinded by the light, which is a possibility. Let me just ask one last question. There was a lot of reference to the earlier today about the linkage between the security communities and health communities. And again, you've had experience through this. I'm thinking of this both as sort of a political messaging where reference was made earlier on. I think you were in the room to how effective a messenger you've been on these issues. So there's both a public messaging role as well as an infrastructure and response role. I just wondered, you talked a lot about the science side. If you could give us some of your thoughts on how to improve that linkage in terms of response.
Between the science and the security?
The security and the health communities.
Yeah. Well, that really worked extraordinarily well, both with Ebola, and we got even better with Zika. Because when we have our discussions as a whole of government response, we did it in a way, we've really got it down well, that in the room, the National Security Council, Lisa Monaco, when we really get up to a big decision, we have Lisa there, we have Amy there, we have the people from the security there, and we have all the health people there. We have the CDC, the FDA, myself, and the secretary, and it really works well. In fact, I wouldn't say surprised, but I was gratified by seeing how when you get really smart security people who always, to their credit, when it comes to a scientific issue, listen to the scientist. But when it comes to the potential impact in a security way, they have an incredible amount of experience, and it's worked very well. It's been one of those things where you come out of the meeting saying, "Why, that was really worthwhile."
Well, given your commitments, before I turn it over to Ashish to say some closing remarks for the day, I just want to say not only was it a very interesting, informative presentation, but like some of the other comments we heard this morning, it's important, I think, for people in this room to thank you for your service in our safety and security, in addition to appreciating the presentation you gave. So thank you very much.
Sorry, guys. I'm trying to hold this so it doesn't fall off. We're finishing up, and there's still some food in the back for those who didn't get a chance to get it. I want to wrap up by just making a couple of remarks, and John had to run off actually to Chicago to listen to the president's farewell speech that he's going to be giving, and so I promised him that I would close up for us. I think we've learned a lot this morning, and as we've headed into the afternoon, and it has, I think, been a remarkable morning of people who have been deeply engaged on these issues, who've really been the national leaders. Certainly in the two panels, people who've been deeply engaged in the last 10, 15 years, and then there really is nobody that the country owes greater gratitude for his extraordinary work on infectious disease, on health security than Tony Fauci. And so to listen to him give that history, I think was pretty extraordinary and a privilege. I'm going to make a couple of remarks of things that I learned, some things we knew coming in, but some things that I think are worth noting. Pandemic prevention and preparedness is going to end up being, whether the administration likes it or not, a priority, a top priority. One of the things I think we heard was there is only one thing we can predict with confidence. There is going to be something unpredictable that the administration is going to have to deal with. And so this is not something where, boy, maybe it'll come up, they may have to deal with it. The second is we artificially, and we knew we were doing this artificially, set up a domestic panel and a global panel. And we knew it was artificial, and you heard it from the first moment that Amy Pope started speaking, that there really is no distinction. That to protect the American people, we have to deeply engage with the global community. Right? There are no walls, there are no barriers. We are in a hyper-connected world, hyper-dependent, interdependent world. That is no longer, if it ever was, a feasible strategy. The third is, because we cannot predict, we have to rely on some tools we have developed. And one of the things that we saw in Dr. Fauci's talk consistently was that slide of the countermeasures. That no matter what the world throws at us, we have a set of countermeasures. And they are science, and they are basic public health. And we cannot get away from those. We have nothing better. And that's what we have to stick with. A couple of other comments. One of the slides that Dr. Fauci had, which I thought was very important, something we learned from Ebola, something we got better with Zika, was that fear spreads faster than diseases. And that is something that we in the public health community, in the global health community, have to get much, much better at acknowledging, understanding, and dealing with. These are scientific issues, but they are also issues of communication, of engagement. A couple of last points. I think you heard a consensus among people with a wide range of political views that we really cannot do this without a public health emergency fund. As much as that is a political tough sell, that is something we are going to need. Second is we're not going to be able to do this without deep engagement with the private sector. And last but not least, one of the things that I took away was this idea that when we make the kinds of investments that we do in public health and in global health, they have effects and payoffs that go far beyond the intended consequences. Right? We did PEPFAR to deal with HIV and AIDS, but it has paid off. It paid off in Nigeria, when Ebola went to Nigeria. It pays off in things like improving maternal and child health. And so we have to begin to connect the dots in global health and pandemic preparedness and say these things are far more interlinked than we think they are. All right, all of you probably had other lessons, but those are some comments that I wanted to quickly highlight, because those are things that I think were some of the highlights of the day. Let me finish off by once again thanking Rebecca Katz, who was really our intellectual leader of the day, Andy and other members of her team who pulled this whole thing off. It looks easy, it's incredibly hard. And so I'm incredibly grateful to Rebecca, members of our team, Liana Waski, Sarah Brandstrader, Margaret Saunders from Health Affairs. This really was a truly collaborative effort. First of many to come, so you're going to be hearing more from us. Thank you all for participating, engaging, and have a good rest of the day, and thank you all for coming.